Let me first thank Randy Quast for this enormous job he's done in the last 2 or 3 years in getting Minnesota NORML up and running. Way back in the 70s, NORML was very active in Minnesota. You were one of the first states that decriminalized marijuana possession and use. I think it was 77, I believe what the year was. Maybe it was a $100 fine, but it sure was a lot better than being arrested and sent to jail. But then there wasn't a lot of activity for a long time. But frankly, there wasn't a lot of activity in most of the country for about 2 decades, from about 1979 until 1996. But the movement is back. I'll get into it a little more in detail. I'll try to explain why we're winning now. It's not luck. It's that we are finally winning the support of a majority of the non-smokers in this country. You know, of course we have the support of the smokers. Christ, we're at risk. You know, 750,000 of us are arrested every year in this country still. So obviously they're going to support legalization efforts. But there are only about 14% of the public smoke marijuana. 86% do not. And in order for us to win this issue and to move forward, as we are doing throughout the country, it is because we have finally, after 45 years, convinced a majority of the American public that prohibition is a failed public policy. Now, let me point out, that's not pro-pot. Most of those Americans who don't smoke but who support our position, it's not because they're pro-pot, it's because they're anti-prohibition. And that's terribly important that we keep that in mind as we move forward. It has to do with how we articulate the issue in a successful manner. Well, again, my name is Keith Stroup. I'm a 70-year-old attorney, and I first smoked marijuana in 1965 when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School, and I've been a regular smoker ever since. And I will tell you, it is a great time to be alive if you're a marijuana smoker. We are finally winning this long fight. I knew we were going to win it because, frankly, the demographics were such. The people who opposed us or opposed our position were people my age and older. But younger people have no trouble with marijuana. They don't all smoke it, but they've been around it. They're familiar with it. It's just no big deal to them. So we knew eventually, as people my age and older died off and got replaced by younger people, we would win. Frankly, I just wasn't sure I'd live long enough to see it. And so I am delighted to see the changes that are taking place. I can tell you, every opportunity I can, I get to Colorado and Washington, and I hope after November 4th I'll include Alaska and Oregon on that list as well. Let me briefly give you a little bit of the history of NORML, only because I think it is relevant to where we go from here on and where I think Minnesota NORML needs to focus as well. First off, I started NORML because of the experience I had working around consumer advocate Ralph Nader in the late 60s and the early 70s in Washington, D.C. I graduated law school in 1968. It was the heart of the anti-war movement, and like most of my generation, I had been radicalized by my fear of being drafted and sent to Vietnam and killed. I had fraternity brothers, undergraduate, who had come back in pine boxes. It was very real. And back then, it was, at my age, they didn't even have a draft lottery. If you were male and you were not in school full time, you were drafted, period. Women were not drafted back then, but all men were if you were not a full-time student. That was a great program to keep all of us in school, I can tell you that. We all went to college, and then after college, we tried to find some grad school that would take us because it was the only way to stay out of the war. But unfortunately, I graduated, I was 25 years old, and you could be drafted till you were 27. And so I ran out of time. Fortunately, I consulted a great group of lawyers called the National Lawyers Guild. They're still around. They still do terrific work. And they were advising those of us who were called draft evaders back at the time as a derogatory term I think they used for us. And basically, they gave me 3 choices. They could hook me up with psychiatrists in Baltimore. I lived in Washington, D.C., who would say I was gay. And back then, if you were gay, it wasn't don't ask, don't tell. They didn't want you. You were out. Well, I thought that wasn't a bad option at all, but my wife did not sure she liked it. I thought that was, back then they used to talk better dead than red when we had the Cold War with Russia. I think she was saying better dead than gay. I think it was because she wasn't facing the war, I was. But a couple of other options they offered me. One was to go to Canada. There was no guarantee you would ever be allowed back in, but they were willing to put you in touch with people in Canada who would help you resettle. As it worked out, President Jimmy Carter allowed the people who left the country to avoid the war. He allowed them back in, I think, the late 70s. So there were only a few years they were kept out of the country, but there was no guarantee of that. The final option I had applied for a job with a new presidential commission called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was a result of Ralph Nader's work, and it was intended to look at unsafe products around the House and recommend to Congress what changes should take place. And the issues at the time, Ralph Nader, for those of you who may not remember, he had come to Washington as a Princeton Law graduate, and he had published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, having to do with the Corvair automobile. It's kind of an old name. Most of you probably never heard of a Corvair. But as a result, he had introduced a lot of us to the concept of public interest law. That is, you use your law degree and your expertise to try to impact public policy rather than to just represent the interest of a particular client. So I got lucky, and with the help of these lawyers, I got what was called a critical skills deferment, which presumed that the work I was doing for this presidential commission was so important that I could serve my 2 years at the corner of 16th and K in Washington, D.C. instead of Vietnam. And I was only too happy to do that. Well, after 2 years, I really had been charmed by this idea of public interest law. So when the commission ended in 70, it was a 2-year commission, I was 27. I was too old to be drafted. So I all of a sudden did have choices in life. And I thought instead of practicing traditional law, I wanted to be a public interest lawyer. But I wasn't really concerned about public safety. It was an okay issue, but it didn't excite me that much. But I had been turned on to smoking marijuana when I was a freshman in Georgetown in 1965. And so the issue that concerned me was legalizing marijuana. So we set up we set up NORML at that time as a public interest lobby to represent consumers. And again, I want to stress that it was because of my experience with Ralph Nader that we initially set NORML up to make sure we represented the interest of smokers, not the industry. I like the industry, and I'll talk more about that later, but there are conflicting interests between consumers and the industry in our field just as there are in any other field. Let me briefly say, because the issue of criminal justice is an important overlay to marijuana legalization. The other person that influenced me to start NORML was a man called Ramsey Clark. And a lot of you remember Ramsey. He was a former U.S. Attorney General. His father had been a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, appointed by Lyndon Johnson. And in fact, his father, Tom Clark, Justice Clark, had to resign from the Supreme Court, or step aside, retire, in order for Ramsey to take over as U.S. Attorney General, because otherwise it would be an automatic conflict every time there was a case before the Supreme Court. So Ramsey had been someone who, I admired from a distance, but when he retired as Attorney General, he had published a book in 1971 called Crime in America, in which he called for the legalization of marijuana. I had never heard or read anything from such a high-level policymaker in this country calling for marijuana legalization. So I was very impressed by it. Also, when Ramsey stepped aside as Attorney General, he almost immediately became an anti-war leader. And in fact, those of you might be old enough to remember, he went to Hanoi with Jane Fonda at one point. They never forgave him for that trip. They thought he was a traitor for sure. But he was simply trying to end an unjust war. So I managed to get to see Ramsey, and I went to him as this young lawyer, and I said, Ramsey, I've read your book. You said we ought to legalize marijuana. I think we ought to legalize marijuana. I've got this opportunity to start a group, but I don't know if I have the courage. I might be destroying the future. I may never again get a job in America. And Ramsey said, no. He said, it's an important issue. Do it, and do it while you're young, because you have more options when you're young. When you get older, you have family responsibilities, other things. It's not as easy to take risky professional decisions. So it was a combination of the influence of Ralph Nader and Ramsey Clark that brought me to the point of starting NORML. Let me see where I am here. Now, I want to talk a little about the history of the modern legalization movement. It actually began in 1970 with the creation of what was called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. That was a presidential commission, and believe it or not, it was established under former President Richard Nixon, who hated marijuana and hated marijuana smokers, but it was inserted by a not terribly well-known congressman at the time named Ed Koch, who subsequently became mayor of New York, and he wasn't so liberal when he was a several-term mayor of New York. But he was a very liberal congressman at that time. And the reason they were passing a new drug bill was because Tim Leary, the Harvard professor of turn on, tune in, and drop out fame, had been busted in coming back from Mexico with, I think, 500 pounds of marijuana at one point. And he had good lawyers, and they challenged the constitutionality of the former Marijuana Tax Stamp Act and actually won. So there were a period of several months in 1970 when there was no federal drug act. Now, it wasn't like drugs were free. Every state had laws against them. But Congress felt that they really had to get a new drug act. And so they passed the Uniform Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Well, Ed Koch managed to get inserted as a minor provision in that, the establishment of this National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. When it was created, none of us expected much from it. They set it up in 1970, just as NORML was starting. And frankly, I contacted them right after they announced their existence and said, I'd like to testify. And within a couple of days, I got a phone call back saying, well, we're not interested, forget about it. You know, what do we care about what you think? So I went back to Ramsey Clark and I said, Ramsey, would you be willing to testify on our behalf as a former Attorney General? And he said, sure. So I wrote the commission back again, or called them and said, former Attorney General Ramsey Clark would like to represent NORML. And they said, we're still not interested. Well, at that point, I took it to Jack Anderson, who at the time was a famous gossip columnist of the Washington Post, and his column was carried all over America. And the next morning, all across the country were these headlines, Marijuana Commission not interested in hearing from former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. And within a couple of hours, Ramsey had a call inviting him to testify, and I had a call inviting NORML to testify. Amazing how sometimes that works. Now, again, I thought initially, since 9 of the members were appointed by President Nixon, 4 were appointed from Congress, I didn't expect much. I thought they were just simply going to come back and repeat the reefer madness mentality of the 50s and 60s and 70s. But interesting things happened when they held those public hearings around the country. I followed them, and I went to each hearing. I testified at a hearing in San Francisco, and I began to realize that some of those commissioners were serious-minded. They were trying to do a good job. One, Tom Ungerleider, for example, from UCLA, was particularly sympathetic, but he wasn't the only one. There were a few. But what was most impressive, at some time, and I didn't find this out until later, they actually held a couple of private hearings and invited actual marijuana smokers to come to private, not hearings, private sessions, and invited marijuana smokers to come and smoke and talk with them, socialize, because most of these people had never met a marijuana smoker, at least none they knew, and they had never seen someone and seen how they behave once they're smoking marijuana. I don't know what they expected, but I'm sure it was something dramatic. Well, what they found was it was no big deal. These people kind of acted like anybody else at a cocktail party, except they didn't get belligerent. So by the time the commission was finished, the first year it was a marijuana report and the second was other drugs, they came down and they didn't have the courage to recommend full legalization. I mean, they would have been just laughed off the stage if they would have. But they did recommend complete decriminalization, and by that I mean absolutely no penalty for the private possession and use of marijuana, and they recognized by then that marijuana smokers culturally shared our marijuana. So they also recommended eliminating all penalties for the sharing of marijuana on a nonprofit basis between consumers, adults. So it wasn't a bad report. Now, at NORML, we were purists and idealists, and the first few weeks after that report came out, we had great internal debates about whether to challenge them, whether to attack them for not going further. Why didn't they go for legalization? When I think about that now, I have to laugh at how naive we are. It was such an important step forward, and we realized that after a couple of weeks. And so we embraced the report. The Marijuana Commission went out of business once they gave the report, there were no provisions to actually try to implement it. So for the next 10 or 12 years, that's all NORML did. We took major experts from around the country, including some of the former marijuana commissioners, and any time a state legislator was willing to introduce a bill to lower penalties or adopt a civil fine, some version of decrim, we would provide experts so that they didn't get hung out to dry. Their position made sense when you heard these experts say, yes, that is what we need to do, where otherwise you just had a young legislator who probably committed political suicide. And indeed, it was a version of that happened in Minnesota, is why you had your law passed in the late, I think it was 77, may have been 76. In any event, by 1978, we had decriminalized marijuana in 11 states. Oregon was the first in 1972, and Nebraska was the last of the 11 in 1978. We didn't know it was the last. In fact, we thought we were about to win this war altogether. We thought there was no turning back. Well, now you can look at the Gallup poll, the history of Gallup polls. When we started NORML in 1970, only 1 year early, Gallup, for the first time ever, had even asked the question of how the American people feel about legalizing marijuana. Until then, it just wasn't considered a serious question. They didn't bother to ask it. When we started NORML, as I say, I'm not even sure I knew this. I probably good that I didn't, or I might not have had the courage. Only 12% of the American public supported us. 88% were opposed. Well, what the surveys show is we began to pick up gradual support until about 78, 79, and then the bottom fell out. We had Ronald Reagan, we had Nancy Reagan, we had Just Say No, we had the rise of the parents group. All of a sudden, instead of being focused on destroying lives by arresting people on marijuana charges, the whole question of we're sending the wrong message to kids. Well, that's a crazy argument, folks. We can't dumb down America to the point where adults are only limited to child-appropriate behavior. We couldn't have sex, drive cars, fly airplanes, get married. You know, I mean, what kind of world would that be? And so we thought it was a silly argument. Well, let me tell you, it caught on. The last victory statewide the marijuana legalization movement had was 78 in Nebraska. For 18 years, we did not win a single statewide victory. That's a dry spell by anybody's definition. And as I say, when you look back at the Gallup data, it's understandable. We only had 18, 19, 20% support at most, and you're simply not going to win with that. But in 1994, when the legalization movement surfaced, or 1996, when it surfaced again after 18 years, it was on the medical use. And as you folks know, in Minnesota, it is an interesting bridge issue. If marijuana can help seriously ill patients, cancer patients, AIDS patients, MS patients, and we all know, of course, it helps lots and lots of people, then it's hard on one hand to say it's a demon drug. It can't be reefer madness and help all of these seriously ill people. So the medical issue indirectly opened a lot of people's minds to looking at the issue freshly for the first time. And remember, my generation and below, we'd had 30 years of propaganda. So it was hard for older Americans to rethink their position. Where was I here? Excuse me a second, got myself lost. It happens as you're an old man. You get out on tangents, you forget where the hell you started. Here's what I want to make the point. The medical issue is incredibly important for seriously ill patients. And of course, in states where you still have total prohibition, it probably makes sense to start with the medical issue because you're going to have more support legislatively or if you have a state initiative. So the strategy makes sense. But I'm afraid for a lot of people, they began to take the position that let's define medical use in a manner that allows everybody to get by and smoke and not get arrested. Folks, that's dishonest on one level. It's not fair to the seriously ill patients because it causes people to disrespect the medical use. But most importantly, this fight is about personal freedom. I am not about to pay a pot doc $150 and ask his permission and say I'm sick in order to have the government leave me alone for smoking a joint in the privacy of my home. And that, in fact, is the difference. I'm getting a signal here that we need to hurry, so let me real quickly skip ahead a little bit. Here we are. It's interesting to think, why are we winning now after all these years? And I think there are a number of very specific reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the demographics. The fact is, the major opponents to legalization have died or retired or moved on, or they're no longer active, and they've been replaced by younger people. There's no denying the fact that that Gallup poll that was 12% when we started is 58% today. And it's not just Gallup. We have two other national polls. One shows, Pew, I think, shows 56, and one other one shows 53. But we have honestly won the support of the hearts and minds of a majority of the non-smokers in this country. But again, part of that is because we introduced the concept of responsible use. I think at one time, everybody's idea of marijuana smoking was kind of a Cheech and Chong thing. And as much as I like, Tommy's a friend and on our advisory board, but we're still living down those damn movies. There are some people that think what a marijuana smoker is somebody who gets up in the morning and smokes all day and sits on the sofa. Marijuana smokers are just average Americans. We work hard, we get up and go to work. We smoke in appropriate situations. We defined back in the early 90s at Normal something called the Principles of Responsible Cannabis Use. And we included, it's for adults only, don't drive while impaired, consider the set and setting, resist abuse, and respect the rights of the non-smokers. Just as you wouldn't go in someone's house today and light up a tobacco cigarette, at least without asking permission. In fact, mostly you wouldn't even do it. Then don't do it with a marijuana cigarette either. Respect other people's rights. Now, a third reason, I think, is the emergence of the medical use issue. And again, in large parts of the country, that's still a new issue. They're still getting used to it and embracing it. But I do think that's helped us. Also, the voter initiative process. You don't have it here. Only half of the states have the option of changing public policy by direct vote of the citizens. But in those states where they have it, we have a vast majority. We can win in many of those states if we can qualify for the ballot, where we could not yet win legislatively. Elected officials are primarily concerned about getting reelected, even the good ones, and they will not go out on a limb, even most of them, even on an issue they know is right, if they think it may put them in a position of vulnerability 2 years later in an election. So the availability of voter initiatives has allowed us to pick off states here and there. We now have 23 states in the District of Columbia that have legal medical use, and we have 2 states, of course, Colorado and Washington, that have full legalization. With some luck, in November 4th, we'll add Oregon and Alaska to that. Also, the emergence of the internet. It allows us to get our version of events out to a wider audience. When I started, when we put out a press release at Normal, it cost us almost, or we'd send out a newsletter, it would cost like $1 a person because you had to print it and mail it and all this sort of stuff. Today, when we send out a press release at Normal, it goes to 1,400,000 people, and it costs nothing once you have the infrastructure set up. You push a button. So that's been incredibly important. And finally, let me just say the gift from Obama. A lot of people were disappointed with Obama because they knew he smoked marijuana as a youth. He wrote about it in his own books, and other people wrote about it. The Stroup game. He was not just a marijuana smoker. He was a devotee. But they expected the first term he was going to run out there and legalize marijuana. That is not the way it works. Presidents, if they do anything daring, it's usually in the first couple of years of their second term when they're not running again. And you realize that's exactly what happened with Obama. When Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana, if the feds would have wanted to, and if we'd had a president or administration that was really hostile, they would have gone into federal court and enjoined those laws. They can't force a state to make possession illegal or use, but they sure as hell can enjoin a law that sets up a licensing system to grow it and sell it because it's a direct conflict with federal law, and the Supremacy Clause kicks in. Obama chose to tell his Department of Justice, no, stand back. So long as those states do it in a responsible manner, and he targeted 2 things. One was avoid marijuana going out of state to states where it's still illegal, and avoid an increase in adolescent use. Those are reasonable things. So he has given us the gift of life. We have 2.5 years to demonstrate we can legalize marijuana, regulate it, and control it in a responsible manner, and the feds are standing back and letting us make that case. So that, I think, is the most important. Now, I know I've got to wrap up, so I will. So, in closing, what does all this mean? Well, we are obviously winning this fight gradually. It's not going to be without some setbacks. I think we're going to lose our medical use initiative in Florida this year. I'm sorry to say they did it as a constitutional amendment. It's got a 60% threshold. I think we'll get more than half the vote, but that is going to be reported as a loss because they chose to do it as a constitutional amendment. We will eventually look back on these last 75 years with some shame. I think just since '72, we've arrested 26 million Americans on marijuana charges, and 90% were for simple possession and use, people like us that just smoke marijuana. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a recent, it was 2003, a Texas sodomy case called Lawrence v. Texas, discussed the privacy provisions of the First Amendment and the liberty interests protected by the Constitution. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who, by the way, is a Ronald Reagan appointee, writing for the majority, said the following: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. It is a promise of the Constitution that there is a realm of personal liberty which the government may not enter." So as I said when I started, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. And with your help, over the next few years, we're going to restore a measure of personal freedom, that realm of personal liberty which the government may not enter, to people's lives all over this country. Speak out, get active, support Minnesota NORML, and together we will finally legalize marijuana in America. Thank you.